how Egypt once again reveals Yahweh's fame, his glory, and his righteous judgments. I'm Jodelle Onstad, and this is episode 121 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I am so glad you are with me. This has been a tough series to get through. We are examining the sins of our forefathers. We are looking at how we walk contrary to him. He walked contrary to us, and we are seeing how this has played out in history. And most of us, there's a verse that I think a lot of us overlook. So turn with me, if you will. We're going to jump right in this morning. Turn with me to Zephaniah 1 verse 12. And here Zephaniah admonishes those who say in their heart, Yahweh will do no good. Neither will he do evil. Most of us want this traditional God, this deity of goodness, where God only does good. He doesn't really do any evil. We're going to take any evil that's in the world and we're going to attribute that to Satan. We're going to cast that off and give it to somebody else. But at Israel's first Exodus, who does it say that sent the evil plagues on Egypt? Who turned the Nile to blood? Who sent frogs? Who did all this evil to Egypt the first time around? It wasn't a devil. It wasn't Satan. It was Yahweh. Yahweh himself performed those judgments. And when we say in our heart that Yahweh will not do evil, guess what? We rob him of that fame. We rob him of that glory. But more than that, we deny ourselves this path to healing. And that is what we are looking at, because we are challenging our inherited beliefs. We are challenging those ideas that we think are sacred, not realizing they're the very drugs that keep us dependent, that keep us separated from God. And they are the very ideas that prevent a teshuvah, not just of one or two people, not just a couple thousand people, but we're looking for a collective consciousness where the whole world all of a sudden says, oh my goodness, what we are doing is not working. Our ways are failing. Our policies are failing. Our morality is failing. And our ideas of God are failing, because that's really the epicenter of where it all begins. It all begins with God. And when that relationship is fractured, when our understanding is compromised, it leads us down to some very dark paths, which is what we are seeing in the world today. So this process of teshuvah, and I want to give you guys credit for sticking with this, because again, this is not an easy series. Challenging the beliefs of our forefathers. As a matter of fact, I actually had a very dear friend of mine call me this week and say, well, I haven't, my forefathers sinned. They're not my sins. They're their sins. Why do I need to pray and confess the sins of my forefathers, as it is clearly stated in Leviticus 26 verses 39 and 40. Why do we need to confess our ancestors' sins? And the reason that is so important to this healing process is that we don't realize that our worldview, our sensitivities, our ideas of morality, our ideas of right and wrong, our perceived ideas that we inherit are shaped by what our forefathers have done. And we have been looking at just one sin, only one sin with regarding the divine name in about the past 3 episodes. And what we can do with this one sin in challenging and confronting it can be replicated with a whole host of other sins. We are walking through the divine name. We are seeing how this sin developed in Judah's history, but today we're going to actually see how it spread throughout all of Abraham's descendants. But we are seeing how this sin became a cancer. On one hand, it protected Yahweh's fame and his reputation, but on the other hand, it separated humanity from Yahweh and delivered humanity to all the curses of the law, especially the judgments. And this is what makes these types of discussions very, very difficult, because human nature is we want to reduce everything that's in scripture. We want to reduce everything that we call our religion or our belief system down to nothing but beliefs. We want to keep it isolated and contained in a vacuum where it's safe and protected, and it doesn't really impact me in my daily life. It has no relevance to anything that's going on in the world. It doesn't have any relevance to anything in history. And when we do that, we deny that path of healing. We do not allow ourselves to access Yahweh's healing code when we separate our beliefs, when we isolate, because it is Yahweh's judgments in history that reveal his righteousness. And it is those judgments that can powerfully humble us today, can make us walk, no longer want those contrary paths, but it can heal our hearts so that we can once again walk righteously with our God. So we are going to continue this path today. We are I'm going to do just a little bit of a recap, but I really want to get into the material today because there is a lot to cover. And again, kudos for sticking with this, because challenging these ideas, it's not the soft namby-pamby religion where you go to church or you go to synagogue for services and they just stroke your ego and they say, oh yeah, we're going to rah, rah, rah. We're going to have some pom-poms. We're going to make you feel really good. We're going to give you a pep talk. Those have their place, and that's important. But not if we don't get that structure right, not if that foundation is not secure. And I'm here to tell you that foundation is not secure. If you chart what we are doing today against the written Torah, every single man-made religion that has a name to it that says, I am this or I am that, we all fail. We all fall short of the way of Yahweh, because guess what? We all add to and we all take away from what is written and from what Yahweh requires of us. So we're going to go through this. And in this, we're going to challenge our worldview. And I hope that your worldview will shift to something that, even though it seems impossible right now, it actually becomes the thing that process of acknowledging we've walked contrary to Yahweh, he's walked contrary to us. It unleashes this powerful healing that is not just one or two people. This is something that can become this collective consciousness whereby the whole entire earth can be healed from the horrific fractures that we have today. So let's return and just recap really quick with Leviticus 26, 40, and 41, where we are looking at this healing code where Yahweh says, if they shall confess their iniquity of their forefathers, their trespass, which they have trespassed against me, and that they have walked contrary to me, and I have walked contrary to them. Remember, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, those are the exact parameters that give very specific instructions, very specific quantitative applications of walking contrary. It includes famine, civil strife, wars, foreign invasion, plagues, diseases of long continuance. All of those are very, very specific things that are enumerated in the Levitical law as part of the testimony, a testimony against a prophetic code that says all of these things will occur if you walk contrary to me. But in this process is where we find healing. Now, let's go back just a little bit, because we are in this series, we are in Jeremiah 44. We've charted the rebellion of under Gedaliah, where Ishmael fractured the Judean remnant that Nebuchadnezzar had left on the land. There were just probably a few thousand people, but they had another civil war where Ishmael assassinated Gedaliah. He started to flee, and then you had Johanan, who came and accosted Ishmael as they were fleeing down to the south, to what is probably modern day Moab, Saudi Arabia, and they sought protection They feared Nebuchadnezzar's wrath, so they sought protection in Egypt. But Jeremiah was with them because Jeremiah had been with Gedaliah. He had refuge and protection by both Nebuchadnezzar with Gedaliah. And all of a sudden they remembered there was this prophet among them. So they sought Yahweh's word from Jeremiah, and they said, should we go to Egypt? Jeremiah received word from Yahweh. He said, do not go. Stay in the land and you will be protected. Don't go to Egypt, because if you go to Egypt, trials and tribulations will occur in Egypt that will pale in comparison to what you and your forefathers received and what you experienced before the Exodus. So this was Jeremiah's admonition. The Jews refused. They said, nope, no, thank you. We are going to walk in our own ways. We want to worship the Queen of Heaven. So we are going to worship the Queen of Heaven as we have been doing for about 120 years. And we're going to sanctify her. She's going to be our God. And they basically said, we want no part of you, Yahweh. This was their response. And Jeremiah issues a warning, and he gives them a sign. So typically, a lot of times, whether we look at Hezekiah being healed, and there's the sign of the sundial going back, or if we look at Isaiah chapter 7, where Isaiah gives a sign to Ahaz regarding the fact that Assyria's, both of their kings, will be destroyed in a very short time period. You find that prophets are always giving signs that their words are going to come to pass. So here in Jeremiah 44, he issues a warning, and he gives them a sign that all of the judgments that will occur against the Jews who have just rebelled against Yahweh, who are going to Egypt. If you look at from, say, about Jeremiah 39 through Jeremiah 44, the judgment against the Jews in Egypt is reiterated something like 5 times. These aren't just 1 or 2 judgments. These are actually horrific judgments where it says very few of you will escape. Like you'll face almost total extinction and annihilation in Egypt if you choose to go there. Remember, this is going back to the house of bondage, the very thing that Yahweh delivered them from. They are choosing to go back to. It's almost as if it nullifies the first Exodus and just kind of throws that in Yahweh's face like, we didn't really want it. We really didn't need it. So here, Jeremiah, and if you'll turn to Jeremiah 44:29, Jeremiah gives the Jews a sign that all of the judgments that he is speaking will come to pass in future history. Now remember, this is after the fall of the first temple, before the second temple is built, but we're going to see that this judgment continues during the second temple period. It proceeds after the second temple is destroyed. It continues during the Byzantine Empire. It occurs during the Ottoman Empire, and even to our modern age. So Jeremiah's prophecies against the Jews in Egypt have very long-lasting consequences. So turn to Jeremiah 44, verses 29 and 30, because what we're going to do, we're going to look at the history, and then we're going to compare that history, or rather we're going to look at the prophecy and then compare that prophecy to actual history. So Jeremiah 44 verse 29 says, and this will be a sign to you. Remember, just like Isaiah 7, where, Isaiah is in the fuller's field and he gives a sign to Ahaz. Well, now Jeremiah is given the same type of sign to the remnant, that everything he's saying regarding Egypt's judgments are going to come to pass. And this will be a sign to you, says Yahweh. I will punish you in this place, that you may know that my words will surely stand against you for evil. Thus says Yahweh, behold, I will give Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hand of his enemies, and into the hand of them that seek his life, as I gave Zedekiah, the king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, his enemy that sought his life. Now, the prophecy here in Jeremiah 44, verse 30, refers to Pharaoh Hophra. Now, he's also known as Apries in historical records, in Greek records. And the Egyptian pharaoh, he was the Egyptian pharaoh of the 26th dynasty in Egypt. And his dynasty reigned from about 589 to 570 BCE. And it's really interesting too, because his assassination. So there was this internal coup whereby Amasis overthrew him and tried to establish his own government, a government that was in opposition to Babylon. And it's really strange. You know how history keeps repeating? Well, the scenario here is very much the same scenario that we find occurred in Judah with Gedaliah's assassination, where there's all of these factions, political factions that are jockeying for power, jockeying to oppose Babylon and trying to preserve their own independence. But here the key fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy, and remember, this is only a sign that all the other judgments, because this isn't the judgment, this is only a sign that all the judgments are going to occur. This sign was fulfilled in 567 when Pharaoh Hophra was assassinated in this internal conflict that pitted native Egyptian interest against Babylonian interest and in Babylonian incursion. And so now we have this setup in Jeremiah 44 that the sign has occurred. So the Jews who were living, who actually immigrated to Egypt in 569, they lived to see the sign fulfilled. And what this means then is that they know that from this point forward, these judgments that Jeremiah is speaking will come upon them and their descendants in the course of history. So it's not going to necessarily be all at once. We tend to think, we try to have this all-in-one end-time scenario. And that really isn't what we see anywhere. If we look at the prophetic code in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, we don't find those ideals being endorsed in the biblical record or even by Israel's prophets. Instead, the idea of end times is more later times. And it's not this one-time event, but it's kind of an ongoing event. Turn with me now to Jeremiah 44, verses 11 through 14, because I want you to look at the very specific things that Jeremiah warns the Jews will occur in Egypt. Now, most of us are familiar with the phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, there's also this concept that everything begins in Egypt. So if you're going to have a new trend, if you're going to have something that becomes vogue or popular, it begins in Egypt and spreads to the rest of the world. In the United States, that's kind of the case with California or New York. You have a trend that occurs and it gets established in California. Maybe it's fashion. Maybe it's a way of talking. Remember, for those of us who were around in the 1980s, remember when Valley Talk was very popular? You'd hear phrases like, yeah, totally tubular, man, or phrases that totally radical. Well, those actually began in the Valley in California, and it kind of spread throughout the rest of the United States. That was really the scenario that you found in Egypt. And the reason is because Egypt was such a key economic player. Egypt held the cradle of civilization just as much as Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia in some ways was a little bit more isolated because it didn't have those Mediterranean seaports where you had contact with Europe, you had contact, with Italy, Cyprus, Turkey, Spain, and all of those seaport regions, the Levant, Israel, Phoenicia. So Egypt played a key role in the ideas, in the development of cultural values and also religious values. I don't know how many of you have read Herodotus, but Herodotus over and over again talks about how Greek mythology, Greek beliefs, and even later Roman beliefs were all influenced and all began in Egypt. And those were kind of exported through contact with Egypt to Greece and Rome. And, at one point in time, scholars were very critical. They were very skeptical regarding Herodotus's opinions and his writings on these ideas. But now later history is coming full circle around, and Herodotus is actually vindicated by what we have discovered in Greek and Roman writings. So now let's look at the exact facts. Let's look at the exact things that Jeremiah 44 verses 11 through 14 states will occur to the Jews in Egypt. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily occur to the native Egyptians in Egypt. It doesn't occur, say, to the Arabs or, other people who are dwelling in Egypt. This is a judgment targeted solely at the Jews in Egypt. So verse 11. Therefore, thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I set my face against you for evil, to cut off all of Judah. And I will take the remnant of Judah, and I will set their faces for those that go into the land of Egypt to live there, and they shall be consumed and fall in the land of Egypt. They shall be consumed by the sword and by famine. So we have two ways of judgment, sword and famine. We're going to look at both of these. And they shall die there, from the least of them to the greatest, by the sword, by the famine, and they shall be an execration, and shall be an astonishment and a curse and a reproach. Now remember, this is a quote from Deuteronomy where it says that I will scatter you among the nations, I will scatter you among the heathen, and there you will become a proverb and a byword. And that really symbolizes the fact that you're going to be persecuted. You are going to be singled out. You're going to be mocked. You're going to be made fun of. But more than that, that making fun and that ridiculing leads to violence against you as a collective group based on your culture, based on your beliefs, based on your ties to being identified as God's people. And the reason this is so important, we want to play the victim card here. We want to say, oh, everybody's innocent, and this just occurs because everybody's an innocent victim. Read what Jeremiah is actually saying. Read what Deuteronomy is saying. This is occurring simply because people are walking contrary to Yahweh. They are in violation of the covenant. And this is Yahweh himself. Remember, this idea, God will not do evil. That's not Israel's God. Yahweh does evil, but he does it righteously, just as Zephaniah says. And Yahweh does evil in applying the curses of the law and in rendering righteously upholding his covenant and making his people a byword and a reproach for walking contrary to him. Back to verse 13. For I will punish them that dwell in the land of Egypt, as I have punished Jerusalem by the sword and by famine and by pestilence, so that none of the remnant of Judah, which are gone forth into Egypt to live there, shall escape or remain. And they shall return to the land that they should return to the land of Judah, to which they shall desire to return to live there. For none shall return and none shall escape. Now, this is a prophecy. Now, what do we tend to do? We package it up. Oh, this is a prophecy, and we put it in its own bubble. It's not going to touch the real world. It's not going to have any application to real history. And in doing that, we rob Yahweh of his fame. We rob him of his glory. So let's reverse that. Let's undo that separation between the scripture and history. And let's look at the beginning. This is only the beginning of the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy. And notice how quickly this occurs, because in the 3rd century BCE, the very first persecutions, the very first kind of underground rumbling occurs, whereby there is a movement specifically against Jews. This doesn't occur in Mesopotamia. It doesn't occur in Rome. It doesn't occur in Turkey or in other nations. It specifically begins to occur in Egypt. Why? Because the Jews had walked contrary. They wanted the Queen of Heaven for their deity. They rejected Yahweh, and they are not following the covenant. They are walking in ways that violate the covenant. And because of that, In the 3rd century BCE, the Egyptian priest Manetho, who most of us rely upon Manetho for his recreation of chronology, his preservation of some of the historical records, and most of our chronology for Egypt is really based on Manetho. But Manetho is really where the whole idea of anti-Semitism really begins, with anti-Jewish propaganda. He portrayed the Jews as lepers. He wanted them expelled from Egypt and accused them of violence against Egyptians. And he laid the foundations for anti-Semitism that continue to this day. Fast forward about 150 years. In the 1st century, Appian of Alexandria promulgated crude anti-Semitic fabrications, contributing again to hostile sentiments against the Jews. In 38 CE, we have the first ever recorded Jewish pogrom, which occurred in Alexandria under Roman governor Flaccus. The Jews were declared foreigners, their homes and synagogues were plundered and burned, and they were confined to a ghetto. They were subjugated to mob violence, which included beatings, burnings, mutilations, and killings. When we read this, are you left questioning, did this occur 2,000 years ago, or did this occur 70 years ago? History keeps repeating over and over again. We think of some of the things that occur in our modern day as being the first time. This is so horrific. This is not the first time horrific things have happened. But why do they happen? Jeremiah tells us that they happen because we're walking contrary to Yahweh, and he's walking contrary to us. There's not just an innocent victim factor here. It's the fact that we are actually adopting ideas that dishonor him, and they pollute the pure knowledge of Yahweh. Now, let's change lanes here just a minute, and let's look at some of the famines, because famine was the other thing that Jeremiah stated would occur while the Jews were in Egypt. One of the first famines that occurred was in 238 BCE, when the Canopus decree under Ptolemaic III Euergetes recorded these huge plummets in the Nile's inundation, and you had a very massive famine. About 18 years later, you had another grain shortage during Ptolemaic Philopator. About 100 years later, we have multiple Nile failures, whereby there was massive famine in Egypt. And then as we come into the Roman period, the early Roman period, you had regional famines that affected the Mediterranean grain supply. Now, let's go back again to this idea of persecution. Because here we're seeing that these are kind of occurring in tandem. You have persecution and famine, persecution and famine, persecution and famine. I don't know how many of you have read 3rd Maccabees, but it records this horrific persecution, which we just previously alluded to, under the Ptolemaic dynasty, whereby this was really the very first pogrom against Jews living in Egypt. And there were a lot of political factions that were occurring. And by this time, Jews were being classified as a very distinct ethnic religious group and an ethnic, culture. And because of this, it led to a lot of internal strife, whereby sometimes they endorsed the wrong candidate, that candidate lost. And then because they supported the wrong candidate, they were basically marked as traitors to the Egyptian government. And you have, in the very early stages of Egyptian history, you had under Philopator, you had a very cogent relationship where the Septuagint was translated, say, in 260 under Philadelphus, where there was that very friendly relationship, and Judaism prospered. The ideas of Torah prospered. But then a very short time later, 16 years later, as a matter of fact, under Philopator in 244, you have one of the most horrific judgments against the Jews living in Israel. So Philopator had made a campaign into Jerusalem. He had sought to desecrate the second temple in Jerusalem, and it failed. It failed miserably. According to 3rd Maccabees 2, 21 through 24, it states there was a divine judgment by Yahweh against Philopator, whereby he was made paralyzed as he attempted to trespass the citadel there at the temple. And when he returned to Egypt, he unleashed that fury of his failed campaign upon the Jews in Egypt. He forced the Jews to register by ethnicity. He branded them with pagan symbols. He enslaved them. He had mass deportations, and he instituted what resemble early concentration camps and hyperdomes for public execution. Now, these actually had like fences, so people walking on roads outside of these hyperdomes could actually look in and see the people inside. I mean, history keeps repeating. And we keep asking, why does it keep repeating? Why does the past become the future? And what Leviticus tells us, what Yahweh and Jeremiah tell us, is because we haven't yet taken those healing steps. We have not yet admit that our actions were contrary to Yahweh. He walked contrary to us, and we have to accept it. Until we come to that point of accepting and realizing that we're even in diaspora today, we're scattered among all people of the earth because of those sins, that then we begin to heal. And then we begin to come out of these continual cycles of judgments. Now, Philopator, whenever he performed this like concentration like event or program, what he did, the method he used is he had made elephants very, very drunk. And the hyperdome was full of nothing but Jews. They were like stacked shoulder to shoulder. And he was going to have these elephants. They were stabbing them kind of like, the bull run that you see in Spain. Well, they were going to make these elephants furious and trample all the Jews to death. Well, in the story in Maccabees, there was an aged man, Eleazar, and he cried out to Yahweh. He cried for protection. He cried for deliverance, and Yahweh mercifully did deliver them, and they did escape persecution at that time. But that was very, very short-lived. It was not long-lasting because they continued to walk in the way of their forefathers. They continued to follow the Queen of Heaven. And just as Leviticus 26:33 warned, where it states, I will scatter you among the heathen, and I will draw a sword out after you, this occurred in Egypt. And it began to occur any place where Israel was scattered among the nations. Because later, Egypt's lost to when Egypt lost Judea to Syria in 200 BCE, it really produced this very contentious relationship between the Jews in Jerusalem and the Jews in Egypt, and there was a great fraternity between both communities. You find when you look at the records, when you look at the letters of correspondence, whether you look at Elephantine, Aswan, and all the historical records that we have, there was this great relationship between Egypt's Jews and Jerusalem's Jews during the Second Temple. And as this occurred, it set up so much of strife and controversy. The previous massacre in Alexandria claimed the lives of 50,000 Jews as there were riots, and then you begin to find all of these anti-Jewish riots. But again, why did this occur? We want to take this history and we want to wash it. We want to anesthetize it and make it very, very separate from scripture. But we forget the fact that previous to this, Jeremiah had given Jews a litmus test 3 different times, even after the fall of the first temple. And the litmus test was always the same. Swear in Yahweh's name. Learn the way of Yahweh's people to swear in his name, such as it states in Jeremiah 12, 16, and 17. And after refusing this 3 different times, Yahweh said that he would remove his name out of the lips of the men of Judah. In Jeremiah 44, verses 26 through 30, he says, I will remove my name out of the mouths of the men of Judah in all the land of Egypt, and I will watch over them for evil and not for good in the land of Egypt. That's Jeremiah 26 and 27. Now, this was a judgment, but also a salvation, because while it judged those who went to Egypt, it saved and protected Yahweh's fame and his reputation, because now, remember what else the Jews said. It wasn't just that they didn't want to swear in Yahweh's name and they refused Jeremiah's test. It was also the fact that they said in Jeremiah 44:17, we will certainly do whatsoever comes forth out of our own mouths. So they are saying that we're not going to walk in your way, Yahweh. We're going to walk in our own way. And when they do this, when you walk in your own way, and if you are going to attribute your own way to the name of Yahweh, that will result in horrific judgments, because you're polluting his name, you're polluting his fame, his reputation, and you're attributing lies to God, and he will hold that accountable. Remember, the 10 Commandments says that Yahweh will not hold those guiltless who profane his name. And by attributing falsehood to God, like not pronouncing his name, that comes with judgment. So this judgment is a two-edged sword. It removed his name from the mouths of the Jews, but it also protected Yahweh's name and his reputation. So we find, as we discussed in our last episode, that the theology of Isis, the mythology of the hidden name, where it was taboo to pronounce the name of the God, because if you discovered his secret hidden name and you said it, just like Rumpelstiltskin, you gained power over that deity. And all of a sudden that deity had to obey you. And it puts man in the place of God. It's a really, really pagan, mythological ideology. But Judah drank from it in Egypt as they worshiped the Queen of Heaven. We saw that Mishnah Yama 6:2. Initially, the priest pronounced Yahweh's name, at least the high priest did, where everybody could hear it on the Day of Atonement, but they only pronounced it once a year during the Second Temple period. By the time we get to Mishnah Sota 7:6, the priest didn't even pronounce it loud enough for Jews in Jerusalem to even hear. And the Levites were refusing the blessing, the Aaronic blessing. They were refusing to pass that on to the people of Israel or the people of Judah, because what did the Aaronic blessing state? It specifically states, bless them in my name, and this was an auditory blessing, that in my name, that I may bless them. So it was the hearing of that name that transmitted that blessing, because then people were going to say, well, how can I be blessed? And that was all came by referring to the written Torah. Well, and we also looked also that Yahweh always gives us our heart's desires. And because of this 300-year continual rejection of refusing the name, not wanting to use it, not wanting to swear in it, and then attributing falsehood to that name, Yahweh begins to use foreigners to render his judgments. And we find that under Epiphanes, we find the first foreign nation prohibiting the use of the divine name, and in Judea and in the land of Israel, the promised land. And then when we come to Mishnah Sanhedrin 10 verse 1, we find that the name becomes where it isn't even pronounced. And there are prohibitions in Judaism against pronouncing the name. Again, in Mishnah Baruch 5:2, it states that he who pronounced the name, just as if it is directly out of the Queen of Heaven's theology, there is this prohibition against pronouncing the name and considering that one who pronounces it as though they've committed some grave sin. But it really transcends even beyond this, because even modern traditions retain today the past sins of the Queen of Heaven, because you find in the welcoming of the Sabbath, the lighting of the candles. First of all, you have this addition to Torah where it says that God has commanded us to light candles, which that is a falsehood. That is a lie. There is no command that God tells us to light candles or light them for Shabbat. That's not there. But then you find in the Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 119a and Bava Kama 32b, and both of those, it personifies the Sabbath as the Queen of Heaven. You welcome the Shabbat Queen. These are very pagan ideas that are retained today. Now, there's kind of a strange innuendo here, because modernly there's a lot of, in this anti-Semitism today, of claiming that the Jews today are not the real Jews of the past, that the people in the land of Israel today are not really Jews. But it is actually in this very strange double entendre here, that it is these very pagan ideas, these pagan traditions that demonstrate that they are the same Jews that went to Egypt, that rebelled against Yahweh. So that rebellion in some ways does show their history. It retains their history, and it shows that, yes, that they are 1/12 of the people of Israel. And they are very, very much, they have ties to Yahweh. They have ties to the Torah. They are God's people despite their continued rebellion. And this rebellion doesn't just occur for Judah, although we've been focusing on that. We're going to also see that it occurs for Ephraim in diaspora too. Because as Yahweh walked contrary to Judah, again, this judgment that occurs in Egypt, again, everything begins in Egypt, but then it begins to spread throughout all nations, throughout all territories. Now, let's go back, because we ended right at the kind of the end of the BCE era, right as Rome is coming into power with the previous judgments that we looked at just a minute ago. Let's look at a little bit more of Jeremiah's words here, and then we're going to look at some more judgments that continue to occur specifically in Egypt during this era. So turn back to Jeremiah 44:26 through 28. I'm just going to read through this very briefly and see this, and we're going to apply this to history again. Therefore, hear ye the word of Yahweh, all Judah that dwell in the land of Egypt. Behold, I have sworn by my great name, says Yahweh, that my name shall no more be named in the mouths of the men of Judah, says Yahweh, or saying thus, or as Yahweh lives. Behold, verse 27, I will watch over them for evil and not for good. And all the men of Judah that are in the land of Egypt shall be consumed by the sword and by famine, till there is none of them. Yet a number that escape shall return out of the land of Egypt to the land of Judah. And all the remnant of Judah that are gone to the land of Egypt to sojourn there shall know whose words shall stand, mine or theirs. So now let's look. Whose words stand? Do Jeremiah's words stand, or do the words of the Judean remnant that were immigrating to Egypt? Let's look at this. In 115 through 117 CE, that now we're getting to the Christian era, during the Kitos War, this was the diaspora revolt, Roman forces suppressed Jewish rebellions in Egypt, leading to the near total annihilation and expulsion of Jewish communities in Egypt and Sinaica. In 414 to 415 CE, expulsion of approximately 100,000 Jews from Alexandria occurred by Saint Cyril. Here again, this was accompanied by a lot of violence and forced conversion to Christianity. 629 CE, the first recorded massacres of Jews in Alexandria underneath the Byzantine rule. Now, of course, previous ones had occurred under the Ptolemies and then under the Romans, but this is now the first one under the Byzantines. In 996 to 1020 CE, now we're coming into the Ottoman Empire under Fatimian Caliph al-Hakim. We hear the Jews are compelled to wear bells around their neck, carry wooden calf images in public, and the Jewish quarter of Cairo was burned down following allegations of mockery. Do you realize how ironic it is where historically, what did Israel say? No, we're not going to worship Yahweh. We're going to worship the Queen of Heaven. And the Queen of Heaven is always associated with the worship of Baal. And now, like 1500 years later, they're made to carry wooden calf images of the very gods that they chose. I mean, this judgment comes full circle. And so often we see this play out over and over and over again, where our rejection becomes the very judgment itself. And we see it play out over and over again in history. So then the question then becomes, how do we keep this? I mean, look at what we've just looked at this morning. We've looked at only 1500 years of Jeremiah's judgments in Egypt, specifically in Egypt. In our next class, we're going to look at how those judgments began to spread throughout the Roman Empire and how they began to consume not just Jews in Egypt, but Jews in Judea, Jews in Rome, and also Ephraim. We're going to see how it began to also consume Ephraim. Because in our next class, we are going to see how contagious beliefs can be. Today, Islam is one of the fastest growing religions. In America, it is growing at a rate of 52%, far beyond any other religion, because beliefs are contagious. And the same occurred 1,500, 2,000 years ago with those beliefs of the Queen of Heaven. And as they began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, first from Alexandria and then to Rome and to Jerusalem, until everybody really became consumed by the very belief. So you have the belief first, and then you have the judgment that follows. But I want to get into this because it sets up this final step whereby we transition from continuing to walk contrary to Yahweh, continuing to walk in our forefathers' sins, to that actual healing process, to where we finally accept. And until we have that heart, and it comes to a conversion, a change of heart, change of mind, and a change of spirit, whereby we are willing to accept these events in world history as a punishment of our iniquity, as the fact that, as Leviticus 26 verse 39 states, we have been pining away in our ancestors' iniquity. We just keep repeating and repeating. But today, I think we are ready for a new day. I think we are ready, finally, after all of these years, to humble ourselves, to humble our hearts, to say, we will not repeat the ways of our ancestors. And I see so many of you. I see your posts on Facebook. I talk with you. I have phone calls with you, private messages, Zoom, everything. And what do I hear? I hear a heart that I have not heard in years past, where people are going, what I did previously isn't working. It violates the written word of Yahweh, and I am not going to walk in it. That is the heart and the spirit that Yahweh is looking for. That is the tenderness to the text, the responsiveness that he is looking for in each of us. And as we continue this process, it sets up a worldwide teshuvah, a collective consciousness that itself is contagious, whereby something that was before that was evil was contagious. Well, guess what? Good can be just as contagious. Righteousness can be just as contagious, where one person, 5 people, 30 people, 5,000 people, 100,000. I mean, this can become, it can light the fire of righteousness in each and every one of us. But it begins with those initial steps of remembering, acknowledging, and accepting. And we are walking through this process, and there is such hope in this. And next time, in our next episode, we are going to finish how these beliefs played out for both Judah and Ephraim. Because don't think for a moment that Ephraim escaped this judgment, because they were caught in it too. And that's you and I, each of us. But then we're going to see how Daniel shows us this healing path and how he used it in his day and Yahweh's response to Daniel's prayer. And we're going to open up. Will Yahweh respond the same to our prayers today? The promise is, if we will seek him, we will find him. If we seek for him with all our heart and soul. I encourage each of you today, get on your knees. Seek Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul. Look at what sins. I mean, today we're looking at the sins of the divine name. Look at other sins. I mean, we're only using this as a template. So look at other things and see how you can learn and how you can grow as we return to Yahweh and we sanctify him and him alone. Thank you so much for joining me today. From my home to yours, shalom.